By the time the FBI formally assumed control, Daniel Mercer's life had been reconstructed down to the minute, yet the most important question remained unanswered. Where did he go after he left the river trail that Saturday morning? Federal analysts overlaid maps, timelines, and behavioral profiles, treating Daniel not as a victim yet, but as a variable in a larger equation. They learned he had altered his jogging route slightly in the weeks before disappearing, extending it past an industrial stretch of warehouses near the river, an area few recreational runners favored. This deviation seemed minor until agents cross-checked it with GPS drift data from his fitness tracker, which showed repeated signal interference near the same location. It suggested Daniel had been there more than once, lingering longer than a normal jog would require. When questioned, his co-workers admitted Daniel had recently asked unusual questions about shipment schedules and trucking companies that serviced the warehouse district, framing them as professional curiosity, but now sounding like quiet probing. The FBI interviewed the last confirmed person to see Daniel alive, a night shift security guard who recalled a man matching Daniel's description standing near a loading dock early Saturday morning, speaking on the phone, agitated, pacing. The guard hadn't reported it initially because nothing appeared overtly criminal. This detail shifted the investigation further away from accident and toward intent. Financial records added another layer. 2 days before his disappearance, Daniel withdrew a modest sum of cash, not enough to run away, but enough to suggest he anticipated an encounter requiring discretion. Rachel struggled with these revelations because they contradicted the brother she thought she knew, not in character, but in secrecy. The FBI assured her secrecy did not imply guilt, it implied fear. As agents dug deeper, they uncovered Daniel had been contacted through an encrypted messaging app by an unknown user weeks earlier. The messages were deleted, but metadata confirmed their existence. This discovery escalated the case internally because it suggested Daniel was communicating with someone who valued anonymity. The question became whether he was a witness, an informant, or an unintended observer. Surveillance footage from a gas station several miles from the river finally produced a breakthrough. It showed Daniel entering the store shortly after his run should have ended, purchasing water, and stepping outside to speak with someone inside a dark SUV parked off camera. Daniel appeared tense, his posture closed, his movements restrained. He did not leave in the SUV, but he did not return toward his apartment either. From that moment, his digital footprint vanished entirely. No calls, no pings, no transactions. The FBI tracked similar SUVs connected to their broader cargo theft investigation and identified one registered to a shell company already under scrutiny. That link was circumstantial, but powerful enough to reframe Daniel's disappearance as a potential witness silencing. Agents hypothesized Daniel may have stumbled upon route manipulations used to divert high-value shipments, recognizing patterns others overlooked because data was his language. If he confronted the wrong people or threatened exposure, his disappearance could have been orchestrated quickly and cleanly. Still, there was no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence of violence. Officially, the case remained a missing person investigation with federal oversight, but internally, language shifted. Analysts began discussing disposal methods, timeline windows for homicide, and probability matrices comparing voluntary disappearance versus foul play. Rachel noticed the change in tone during briefings, the careful wording, the way agents avoided saying Daniel's name too often, as if bracing for its replacement by another term. Meanwhile, rumors spread online, some accusing Daniel of involvement in criminal activity, others speculating he had entered witness protection. Rachel fought these narratives publicly, clinging to the belief that her brother was alive somewhere, waiting for rescue. The FBI neither confirmed nor denied possibilities, but behind closed doors, a pivotal decision loomed. Without a body, without a confession, could they escalate the case to a murder inquiry? The answer depended on one thing they had yet to secure: proof that Daniel Mercer's disappearance could not be explained by any scenario in which he survived. As agents pursued that proof, time became their enemy, because with every passing day, the chance of recovering truth or remains diminished. What they did not yet know was that the evidence they needed had been hiding in plain sight, embedded not in Daniel's final hours, but in a pattern of disappearances that no one had thought to connect until now. The pattern emerged slowly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, through comparison rather than discovery, when an analyst cross-referenced Daniel Mercer's timeline against unresolved missing person cases from neighboring states and noticed similarities that were impossible to ignore. Each case involved an adult male with no history of instability. Each vanished near transportation corridors tied to logistics or shipping infrastructure, and each left behind a life paused mid-sentence rather than concluded. None of the cases had initially been treated as suspicious, because none involved obvious violence, ransom demands, or signs of struggle. They were catalogued as unfortunate mysteries, scattered across jurisdictions, diluted by distance. But when the FBI overlaid them, common elements surfaced. Brief spikes in data access beyond professional roles, unexplained route changes, and sudden communication with unknown contacts shortly before disappearance. Daniel's case fit too neatly into this emerging framework to dismiss as coincidence. The realization forced agents to reconsider the narrative they had built, because it suggested Daniel was not an isolated incident, but part of a mechanism that removed people quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. This raised a disturbing possibility that the perpetrators had refined their methods over time, learning how to erase individuals without triggering alarms. As the investigation widened, the FBI re-interviewed families from the other cases, asking questions that had never been posed before. They learned of similar details. Fitness trackers that stopped abruptly, cars left behind, phones abandoned, loved ones insisting something was wrong despite official reassurances. Rachel was informed of these parallels in a controlled briefing, and the knowledge devastated her, because it meant Daniel's disappearance was neither random nor reversible. The question shifted from where he was to what had been done to him. Agents began scrutinizing warehouse districts along major rivers and highways, identifying properties owned or leased by shell companies connected to the cargo theft ring. Environmental data was analyzed for anomalies, soil disturbances, and irregular waste disposal patterns, not because they had evidence of murder yet, but because the absence of evidence was beginning to function as evidence itself. One warehouse in particular drew attention, a nondescript structure with frequent nighttime activity and a history of short-term tenants. It sat less than a mile from the point where Daniel's fitness tracker went dark. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed vehicles entering and exiting during odd hours on the weekend Daniel vanished, including the same model SUV seen at the gas station. Still, nothing definitively tied Daniel to that location. The FBI faced a dilemma: escalate too early and risk tipping off suspects, or wait and risk losing what little trail remained. Internally, the case classification became a matter of debate. Some argued that without a body, the term murder was speculative, that federal resources should focus on building conspiracy charges related to theft. Others countered that the pattern itself constituted probable cause, that repeated disappearances following the same structure indicated lethal intent. As discussions unfolded, Rachel continued to live in limbo, haunted by the duality of hope and dread. She noticed agents stopped asking if Daniel might return and started asking how he had changed in the months before he vanished. They wanted details about his fears, his stress levels, his silences. She recalled conversations where Daniel mentioned feeling watched, not in paranoia, but in caution, lowering his voice when discussing work, changing topics abruptly. At the time, she dismissed it as job pressure. Now, it felt like foreshadowing. The FBI subpoenaed server backups from Daniel's company, recovering fragments of deleted queries that suggested he had identified discrepancies in shipment routes, anomalies that pointed to intentional diversions. He had flagged them internally, but his concerns were buried in bureaucracy, unnoticed by supervisors who saw only numbers, not narratives. Investigators theorized Daniel may have reached out externally when internal channels failed, inadvertently alerting those responsible. If so, his disappearance was not spontaneous, but premeditated, timed to minimize witnesses and maximize deniability. This theory pushed the case past its tipping point. Senior officials authorized a quiet reclassification, allowing agents to pursue the investigation as a potential homicide without public announcement. The language changed in internal documents, from missing to deceased, from search to recovery. For Rachel, the shift was subtle but unmistakable, reflected in the careful condolences embedded in updates. The FBI had not found Daniel's body, but they had found something else just as damning. A system that treated human lives as variables to be eliminated. And once a system reveals itself, it rarely stops at one victim. Once the investigation crossed the invisible line into homicide territory, the FBI's approach hardened, not in emotion but in method, because certainty now mattered more than possibility, and every assumption had to be tested until it either broke or held. Agents focused on the warehouse identified earlier, not as a crime scene yet, but as a node within a network, mapping its ownership history, utility usage, waste contracts, and patterns of activity that could reveal what its walls concealed. Electricity records showed unusual spikes during overnight hours on weekends, inconsistent with storage operations, while water usage suggested periodic deep cleaning cycles. None of this proved murder, but together it suggested something being concealed rather than something being stored. The FBI quietly obtained warrants and began monitoring the site, tracking vehicles, faces, routines, learning who belonged and who passed through. Among those faces was a man named Victor Hale, a logistics consultant with no public ties to the cargo theft ring, yet whose shell companies intersected repeatedly with suspect properties. Hale was careful, disciplined, and boring by design, the kind of person whose normalcy functioned as camouflage. Agents discovered Hale had contacted Daniel Mercer through an encrypted platform weeks before his disappearance, presenting himself as a whistleblower seeking analytical help. This reframed Daniel's actions not as reckless curiosity, but as ethical intervention, a man trying to expose wrongdoing using the only language he trusted: data. The tragedy, if confirmed, was that his trust had been weaponized against him. As surveillance continued, agents watched Hale meet with associates, exchange briefcases, and visit the warehouse at irregular intervals, never staying long enough to raise alarms. Financial forensics revealed payments routed through foreign accounts, timed to coincide with disappearances across the pattern map. Each payment was small enough to avoid scrutiny, large enough to incentivize silence. The FBI's theory solidified. Daniel had been lured, confronted, and eliminated because he threatened a system that depended on invisibility. Still, without physical proof, theory remained theory. That proof came unexpectedly through an unrelated inspection. Environmental regulators flagged the warehouse for improper waste disposal, triggering a routine audit that allowed federal agents lawful access without tipping off suspects. Inside, investigators found nothing overt, no blood, no restraints, no weapons. It was the absence that spoke loudest. Floors had been resurfaced recently, drains replaced, walls repainted in patches inconsistent with maintenance schedules. Forensic teams collected samples anyway, testing soil from drainage systems and residue from ventilation filters. Weeks later, results confirmed trace amounts of human biological material degraded by chemical agents, enough to indicate cleanup, not accident. This finding changed everything. The FBI now had grounds to publicly escalate the case, to say what families feared and officials avoided. Daniel Mercer was presumed dead. Rachel received the call in the same apartment where she had waited for months, the same couch where hope had worn thin. The words were careful, compassionate, but final in tone. The investigation shifted again, now focused not on if Daniel had been killed, but how, when, and by whom. Hale was brought in for questioning under the guise of a financial inquiry, his composure unshaken, his answers precise, rehearsed. He denied knowing Daniel personally, dismissed the encrypted messages as coincidence, framed his business as consulting. Agents pressed, introducing evidence slowly, watching micro-expressions, noting pauses. Hale remained calm until confronted with the warehouse findings. Then, for the first time, something flickered, not fear, but irritation, as if the script had been altered unexpectedly. That flicker told agents they were close. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared a case built largely on circumstantial architecture, patterns, financial trails, environmental evidence, and witness testimony from other cases. It was risky, but necessary, because waiting for a body that might never be recovered would mean surrendering justice to probability. The FBI coordinated with state authorities to reopen related cases, informing families that their loved ones were now considered homicide victims, a designation that reopened wounds, but also validated years of intuition. Rachel joined these families in a grim community bound by absence, sharing details, timelines, fragments of memory that collectively painted a clearer picture of the machine that had consumed their loved ones. As the case moved toward indictment, Hale disappeared, abandoning his carefully curated normalcy, confirming what evidence already suggested. His flight triggered a manhunt that stretched across borders, but it also cemented the narrative publicly. This was no longer a missing person story gone cold. It was a murder inquiry exposing how quietly lives could be erased when assumptions went unchallenged. For Rachel, the truth arrived not as closure, but as clarity, replacing uncertainty with something heavier, more permanent, yet real. Daniel had not chosen to vanish. He had been removed, and the system that removed him had underestimated one thing. Patterns once seen cannot be unseen, and those who follow them do not stop at the first answer, but at the last truth. The public announcement that Daniel Mercer's case was now a federal murder inquiry changed the rhythm of everything. Because once a disappearance is named a killing, denial loses its shelter, and everyone connected must choose a side. Media attention surged, not with sensational details, but with questions about how a man could be erased so completely that months passed before his death was acknowledged. Rachel became the reluctant voice of the story, not because she wanted attention, but because silence had already cost too much. She spoke carefully, emphasizing who Daniel was rather than how he was believed to have died, hoping to reclaim him from becoming just another statistic. Behind the scenes, the FBI accelerated efforts to dismantle the network they believed responsible, focusing on logistics companies, shell corporations, and consultants whose names surfaced repeatedly across financial ledgers and shipping anomalies. Each thread pulled revealed another, forming a web that spanned ports, highways, and warehouses across multiple states. Investigators realized the disappearances were not collateral damage but operational safeguards, removing individuals who noticed patterns threatening to expose the theft pipeline. Daniel's analytical mind had made him dangerous without his intending to be. As warrants multiplied, several lower-level participants were arrested on unrelated charges, tax evasion, regulatory violations, minor fraud, and under pressure, some began to talk. Their testimonies did not mention Daniel by name, but they described a protocol for problem solvers, individuals brought in to neutralize risks quietly. The language was chillingly clinical, devoid of violence in phrasing but rich in implication. According to one witness, these operations were designed to leave no trace, no body, no scene, ensuring missing person cases would languish in uncertainty until attention faded. The FBI compared these accounts with forensic findings from the warehouse, aligning methods with results, strengthening the case incrementally. Rachel listened to these developments with a mixture of vindication and despair, because each confirmation of wrongdoing pushed Daniel further into the past tense. She struggled with anger, not just toward those who had taken him, but toward the initial assumptions that delayed escalation. The idea that adults choose to disappear had provided cover for something far darker. Internally, the FBI conducted a review of similar cases nationwide, questioning whether other patterns had been missed, other lives lost to the same logic. Daniel's case became a reference point, cited in briefings as an example of how data-driven crimes exploit institutional hesitation. As the investigation expanded, agents traced Victor Hale's movements through international financial systems, discovering he had not fled randomly, but along pre-established routes, using the same logistical expertise that had enabled the crimes. This reinforced the belief that Hale was not merely a facilitator but a central architect, someone who understood how to move goods, money, and people invisibly. Efforts to locate him intensified, involving foreign counterparts and monitoring ports and border crossings. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared for the possibility that Hale might never be apprehended, constructing cases against the remaining network members to prevent future disappearances. The absence of Daniel's body remained the greatest challenge, both legally and emotionally. For Rachel, grief existed without ritual, without a funeral, without a place to visit. She attended meetings with other families, sharing stories that mirrored her own, routines interrupted, phones left behind, lives frozen mid-motion. Together, they pressured lawmakers to reconsider how missing person cases are classified and escalated, arguing that patterns should trigger intervention sooner. Their advocacy gained traction, sparking policy discussions about data sharing between jurisdictions. Daniel's legacy, unintended as it was, began to form around prevention rather than resolution. As months passed, new evidence surfaced from an unexpected source. A former associate of Hale, arrested abroad, agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. His testimony described Daniel's final hours indirectly, confirming that Daniel had been confronted, interrogated, and ultimately killed when he refused to abandon his findings. The details were sparse, delivered without emotion, but they confirmed what Rachel already knew in her bones. The FBI documented the account meticulously, aware that even second-hand testimony could tip the balance in court. When Rachel was informed, she did not cry. The waiting had already consumed her tears. Instead, she asked one question, whether Daniel had been afraid. The answer was uncertain, but agents told her he had been resolute, refusing to retract his concerns. That knowledge became her anchor, a final affirmation of who he was. As indictments were unsealed and arrests made, the story shifted again, from mystery to reckoning. Yet even as justice moved forward, the cost remained immeasurable, because no conviction could return what had been taken. Daniel Mercer's case exposed how easily silence can masquerade as choice, how systems exploit assumptions, and how truth often arrives too late to save those who seek it. The FBI closed one chapter by naming the crime, but the broader narrative continued, echoing in every unresolved disappearance, every family still waiting, every pattern not yet seen. As the legal process unfolded, the narrative around Daniel Mercer evolved from an isolated tragedy into a case study in how modern crime adapts to institutional blind spots, and the FBI leaned into that evolution with an urgency shaped by regret. Agents began briefing other field offices, sharing the indicators they wished they had recognized sooner, the subtle signs that distinguish voluntary disappearance from orchestrated removal. These briefings were not public, but their impact rippled quietly, changing how similar cases were evaluated nationwide. Rachel noticed the shift when families from other states reached out, saying their missing loved ones' cases had been reopened after years of stagnation. Each message carried gratitude and sorrow, because while renewed attention offered hope, it also underscored how long silence had prevailed. The FBI's internal review concluded that Daniel's case had crossed a critical threshold weeks before his disappearance was reclassified, a threshold obscured by assumptions about adult autonomy and the absence of overt violence. This conclusion did not assign blame to individuals, but it acknowledged systemic inertia, the cost of waiting for certainty in a world where certainty is engineered to be invisible. Meanwhile, prosecutors faced the challenge of translating complex patterns into narratives a jury could understand, narratives that conveyed intent without sensationalism. They constructed timelines that showed how Daniel's data access intersected with theft operations, how his outreach triggered responses, and how those responses culminated in his death. Each element had to stand alone and together, forming a mosaic of culpability. Defense attorneys predictably attacked the lack of a body, framing the case as speculative, arguing Daniel could have fled, changed his identity, started anew. The FBI countered with evidence of financial stasis, abandoned assets, and the biological traces at the warehouse, emphasizing that disappearance without preparation is not escape but interruption. Rachel attended pretrial hearings when she could, sitting quietly, absorbing legal language that reduced her brother's life to exhibits and motions. She understood the necessity, but the abstraction hurt because it stripped Daniel of context, of humor, of humanity. To counter this, she worked with victim advocates to humanize the case publicly, sharing stories of Daniel's habits, his kindness, his refusal to ignore inconsistencies. These stories reframed him not as a victim of chance, but as a casualty of conscience. As the trial date approached, international cooperation intensified, and Victor Hale's movements narrowed to a region known for lax extradition agreements. Diplomatic channels engaged, leveraging economic pressure and legal treaties, slowly constricting his options. The FBI prepared for both outcomes, capture or absence, ensuring the case against the remaining defendants did not hinge on Hale's presence alone. Witnesses from the network testified under protection, describing meetings, coded language, and the unspoken understanding that problems were not solved through negotiation but elimination. Their testimonies corroborated each other in structure if not detail, painting a consistent picture of method and motive. For Rachel, hearing these accounts was both validating and devastating, because each confirmation of wrongdoing erased lingering fantasies of rescue. Grief settled into a different shape, less raw but heavier, accompanied by anger directed not just outward but inward, at missed signs, unanswered calls, conversations deferred. She sought counseling, not to forget, but to learn how to carry the knowledge without being consumed by it. As months turned into a year, verdicts were reached. Several defendants were convicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. Sentences were long, reflecting the gravity of crimes that thrived on invisibility. Hale was eventually detained abroad, his arrest announced quietly, without spectacle, a footnote compared to the life he had helped erase. Extradition proceedings followed, slow and bureaucratic, but inevitable. When Hale was finally brought before a court, his demeanor mirrored earlier interrogations, composed, detached, as if the proceedings were an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. Rachel did not attend his initial appearance. She chose instead to visit the river trail where Daniel's run had ended, not to mourn, but to mark the place where certainty dissolved. She walked the path, noting its ordinariness, how easily life could intersect with danger unnoticed. The case's resolution did not bring closure in the cinematic sense. There was no confession detailing Daniel's final moments, no remains to bury, no singular moment of catharsis. Instead, there was accountability, partial but meaningful, and a legacy that altered how disappearances were interpreted. The FBI incorporated lessons from the case into training, emphasizing pattern recognition and cross-jurisdictional analysis. Daniel Mercer's name appeared in internal documents as a reminder of what happens when assumptions go unchallenged. For Rachel, the legacy was more personal, a commitment to advocacy, to speaking for those whose voices were silenced before they could finish telling their stories. She understood now that closure is not an event but a process, one that unfolds unevenly, shaped by memory and purpose. Daniel's story had begun with silence, but it did not end there. It continued in changed protocols, reopened cases, and the quiet determination of families who refused to accept disappearance as explanation. In that continuation lay a measure of justice, imperfect but real, anchored not in certainty, but in resolve. Time did not heal the absence Daniel Mercer left behind, but it did change how that absence was understood, transforming it from a private wound into a public warning that lingered long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded. Rachel discovered that grief evolves when it is shared with purpose, when pain is redirected into vigilance, and she became a quiet but persistent presence in discussions about missing persons policy, speaking not as an expert, but as someone who had lived the consequences of delay. Her testimony before advisory panels was calm, factual, and devastating in its simplicity, recounting how easily Daniel's disappearance had been explained away, how reassurance had masqueraded as procedure, and how assumptions had nearly buried the truth forever. The FBI, for its part, continued to refine its approach, integrating algorithmic tools designed to flag anomalies across jurisdictions, tools inspired in part by the same analytical mindset Daniel had used in his work. It was a bitter irony that his way of seeing patterns became a safeguard only after it was too late to protect him. As reopened cases progressed, some families received answers that Rachel never would: bodies recovered, timelines confirmed, final moments clarified. She accepted this disparity without resentment, understanding that justice is uneven by nature, shaped by circumstance rather than fairness. What mattered was that fewer families would be left waiting in the dark without explanation. Public perception of the case shifted as documentaries, articles, and discussions framed it not as a mystery solved, but as a system exposed. The question audiences asked was no longer what happened to Daniel Mercer, but how many others had vanished under similar assumptions, their stories untold because no one connected the dots. This reframing unsettled institutions because it implied responsibility extended beyond perpetrators to processes themselves. Law enforcement agencies responded defensively at first, but gradually acknowledged the value of introspection, recognizing that modern crime thrives on predictability, exploiting the gaps between agencies, the comfort of precedent. Rachel was invited to observe training sessions where agents reviewed anonymized cases, identifying decision points where escalation might have changed outcomes. Watching this, she felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow, pride that Daniel's death had meaning beyond itself, sorrow that meaning required loss. Meanwhile, Victor Hale's trial unfolded with less drama than expected, his guilt established through meticulous documentation rather than emotional testimony. He was convicted on multiple counts, including conspiracy related to Daniel's murder, and sentenced to decades in prison. The sentence was reported briefly, a procedural conclusion to a long story, but for Rachel, it marked an end to one chapter of vigilance. She did not feel relief so much as release, a loosening of the constant readiness that had defined her life for years. Yet even as one case concluded, others emerged, some echoing familiar patterns, others revealing new variations. Rachel learned that vigilance must adapt as well, that systems improve but never perfect themselves. She continued to speak, to listen, to support, understanding that advocacy is sustained not by outrage, but by endurance. In quieter moments, she allowed herself to remember Daniel not as a symbol, but as a brother, recalling shared jokes, childhood arguments, mundane rituals that had nothing to do with crime or consequence. These memories grounded her, reminding her that Daniel's life was not defined by its end. The FBI's annual report on major cases included a section on lessons learned, citing Daniel Mercer's case as instrumental in developing cross-agency pattern analysis protocols. It was a small paragraph in a dense document, but its presence mattered, a formal acknowledgement that one overlooked disappearance had reshaped how many were handled afterward. Analysts debated probabilities and thresholds with renewed caution, aware that behind every data point was a human life. Rachel received letters from agents she had never met, thanking her for her persistence, apologizing in ways both direct and oblique. She accepted these gestures without bitterness, recognizing sincerity where it existed. Over time, the river trail where Daniel's run had ended became less a site of loss and more a place of reflection. Rachel walked it occasionally, noting how unchanged it remained, how easily tragedy blends into ordinary landscapes. She realized that this ordinariness was part of the danger, that crimes designed to look like nothing exploit the comfort of familiarity. Daniel had noticed what others overlooked because he questioned that comfort. His fate was a reminder of the cost of questioning, but also of its necessity. As years passed, new technologies emerged, new forms of crime developed, and the specifics of Daniel's case receded into archives, but its core lesson persisted. Disappearances are not neutral events. They are narratives interrupted, signals demanding interpretation rather than dismissal. Rachel's life settled into a rhythm shaped by this understanding, balancing remembrance with forward motion. She did not seek to be defined by loss, but she refused to let loss be ignored. Daniel Mercer's story, once a whisper in a missing persons file, had become a reference point, a cautionary example taught to those tasked with protecting others. That transformation did not redeem his death, but it honored his instincts, his refusal to look away. In that sense, Daniel remained present, not in the way Rachel once hoped, but in a form that endured, embedded in systems changed, minds sharpened, and assumptions questioned. The story that began with silence ended not with closure, but with awareness, an ongoing obligation carried by those who learned from it, and by those who continue to look for patterns where others see none. Even after the convictions, the shadow of Daniel Mercer's case lingered within the FBI in ways that statistics could not capture, shaping instincts rather than procedures, and those instincts quietly altered how agents reacted when the next call came in reporting someone missing. Analysts who had worked Daniel's file found themselves pausing longer over details once considered mundane: a parked car, an abandoned phone, a routine interrupted without explanation. The case had taught them that normalcy can be staged, that the absence of chaos does not imply the absence of violence. Rachel noticed this change most clearly when an agent called her, years later, not for information, but to thank her again, explaining that a recent case had been escalated early because Daniel's story had been cited during an internal briefing. That escalation led to the recovery of a man still alive, held temporarily while criminals debated whether he posed a threat. The knowledge that Daniel's death had indirectly saved someone else did not bring joy, but it softened the sharpest edge of grief, offering proof that loss can still generate protection. Public interest in the case surged again when a journalist published a long-form investigation examining how missing persons are categorized, using Daniel's disappearance as a central example. The article avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on process, delay, and the psychology of assumption. Readers responded intensely, flooding comment sections with stories of loved ones who vanished quietly, whose cases stalled because nothing looked wrong enough. Rachel read these stories late at night, recognizing the same phrases she had heard years earlier. He wouldn't just leave. She always called. Something felt off. Each repetition reinforced the truth that intuition, when dismissed systematically, becomes another casualty. The FBI monitored the public reaction carefully, aware that trust is built not only through success, but through transparency about failure. Officials acknowledged that Daniel's case exposed a gap between policy and practice, one that required continuous correction rather than a single reform. Internally, task forces were formed to review cold missing person cases through the lens of pattern analysis, applying lessons learned to files long considered dormant. Some yielded breakthroughs, others did not, but the act of re-examination itself signaled a shift from closure to curiosity. Rachel participated in a symposium where law enforcement, data scientists, and victim advocates discussed these efforts openly. Sitting in that room, she realized how unusual it was for grief to be invited into professional discourse, how often emotional realities are excluded in favor of metrics. Yet it was precisely that emotional reality that had driven her persistence, that had refused to accept procedural reassurance as truth. She spoke briefly, reminding attendees that behind every case number was a network of relationships disrupted without warning. Her words were not dramatic, but they lingered because they articulated what charts could not. As years passed, Daniel's name appeared less frequently in media, replaced by new cases, new narratives, but within certain circles, it remained a reference, a shorthand for a specific failure and its consequences. Training materials cited the Mercer threshold, an informal term describing the point at which patterns outweigh the absence of evidence. This threshold was not fixed, but contextual, requiring judgment rather than automation. Agents debated its application, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes erring on the side of caution, aware that caution itself could be double-edged. Rachel understood this complexity, resisting simplistic demands for immediate escalation in every case, advocating instead for responsiveness informed by context. Her advocacy matured, shifting from urgency alone to nuance, because she had learned that systems change best when challenged intelligently rather than emotionally. Privately, she continued to wrestle with unanswered questions, the specifics of Daniel's final moments, the exact words exchanged, the instant when his fate became irreversible. These details remained unknowable, and accepting that unknowability was perhaps the hardest lesson. She learned to live without resolution, to carry ambiguity without letting it define her days. Occasionally, she dreamed of Daniel alive somewhere, older, changed, reaching out at last. She woke from these dreams without despair, recognizing them as the mind's way of preserving connection. The FBI sent her a copy of their updated missing persons protocol, a dense document filled with conditional language and flowcharts. She read it carefully, understanding its limitations, appreciating its intent. It was not a memorial, but it was a response, and in that response, she found a measure of acknowledgement. The case had taught institutions to listen differently, to weigh silence as a signal rather than an absence. For Rachel, that lesson extended beyond law enforcement, shaping how she listened to others, how she noticed when routines broke, when voices went quiet unexpectedly. She became attuned to interruptions, to pauses that felt wrong. This attentiveness did not make her fearful. It made her present. Daniel's life, once defined by data and patterns, had ultimately reshaped how patterns were perceived by those tasked with protection. His death had not been meaningless, though meaning could not compensate for loss. As the world moved on, as new stories replaced old ones, the quiet legacy of his case persisted, embedded in decisions made quickly, in questions asked sooner, in assumptions challenged before they hardened. Rachel carried that legacy forward not as a burden, but as a responsibility, one she neither sought nor rejected. The story that began with a missing phone call had expanded into a broader awareness, a reminder that disappearance is rarely neutral, that silence often demands interpretation. In honoring that demand, Daniel Mercer's story continued to influence outcomes long after its conclusion, not loudly, not visibly, but persistently, like a pattern once recognized and never ignored again. Long after the legal outcomes were finalized and the institutional changes codified, Daniel Mercer's absence continued to surface in unexpected ways, not as a wound reopening, but as a quiet reckoning that followed Rachel through ordinary moments. She noticed it when she hesitated before dismissing a missed call, when she paid closer attention to inconsistencies in stories people told about their own lives, when silence itself seemed to demand interpretation. This heightened awareness was not paranoia, but memory reshaped into instinct. The FBI, too, carried the case forward in less visible forms, embedded in how agents spoke during briefings, how supervisors challenged early conclusions, how analysts resisted the comfort of incomplete explanations. New agents learned the story not as lore, but as caution, an example of how easily logic can become complacency when it is untested. Daniel's name surfaced during debates about resource allocation, about when to escalate, about how much weight intuition should carry alongside evidence. There was no consensus, only a shared understanding that certainty delayed can become denial. Rachel remained involved, but she gradually stepped back from public advocacy, recognizing the need to reclaim parts of her life that had been paused since Daniel vanished. She returned to work, reconnected with friends, allowed laughter back into spaces once dominated by vigilance. This was not forgetting, but integration, allowing grief to coexist with forward motion. Occasionally, she was invited to speak to new investigators, and she accepted selectively, focusing on listening as much as talking. She learned that many agents carried their own unresolved cases, their own doubts about outcomes that never quite satisfied. In those conversations, she recognized a shared burden, the weight of responsibility borne differently by families and professionals, yet connected by the same unresolved questions. Public memory of Daniel's case faded gradually, replaced by newer tragedies, newer headlines, but within data systems, his file remained active, referenced, cross-linked, annotated with lessons learned. Analysts revisiting old cases sometimes stumbled upon his name unexpectedly, a reminder embedded within databases that mirrored his own work, patterns within patterns. Rachel found a strange symmetry in that, Daniel becoming part of the very analytical fabric he once navigated. On anniversaries of his disappearance, she marked the day privately, walking the river trail or simply sitting with memories unstructured by ceremony. She no longer searched for signs or meaning in these rituals. Their value lay in acknowledgement. The world had not stopped when Daniel disappeared, and accepting that fact was part of healing. The FBI's annual internal audit eventually concluded that while reforms improved responsiveness, no system could eliminate risk entirely, a conclusion both sobering and honest. Rachel appreciated that honesty more than assurances of perfection. She understood that vigilance is ongoing, that every generation must relearn lessons at a cost. In rare moments of quiet reflection, she imagined what Daniel might think of the changes his case inspired. She believed he would be conflicted, proud that patterns were recognized, saddened that recognition required loss. That imagined response comforted her, aligning with the brother she knew, principled, analytical, unwilling to accept easy answers. The case's enduring impact was subtle but profound, influencing decisions made under pressure, encouraging hesitation before dismissal. Rachel carried this influence into her own relationships, becoming someone others confided in, someone attuned to shifts in behavior, interruptions in routine. She did not see herself as vigilant in a heroic sense, but as attentive, honoring Daniel by noticing what others might overlook. In this way, his life continued to ripple outward, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of awareness. The story that once consumed her life settled into a quieter place, no longer dominating every thought, but present enough to shape perspective. Rachel learned that resolution is not always about answers, but about alignment, aligning memory with purpose, loss with meaning. Daniel Mercer's case had begun as a missing person report, escalated into a murder inquiry, and ultimately transformed into a lens through which silence itself was examined. That transformation did not undo what happened, but it altered what followed, ensuring that disappearance would no longer be treated as absence alone. For Rachel, and for those who learned from the case, that shift mattered. It meant that Daniel's story did not end with his removal, but continued as a quiet insistence that patterns be seen, that assumptions be challenged, that silence be questioned before it became permanent. The story of Daniel Mercer ultimately settled into something less dramatic than headlines and more enduring than verdicts, becoming a reference point for how truth can emerge slowly, shaped by persistence rather than revelation. Rachel understood this better than anyone, because she had lived every phase of the transformation, from uncertainty to confirmation to aftermath, and she knew that endings rarely feel complete. What remained with her was not the violence that had taken Daniel, but the clarity that followed, the understanding that disappearance is an action, not a condition, and that inaction can be as consequential as wrongdoing. Over time, she stopped waiting for new information, accepting that the record was closed even if questions remained. This acceptance was not resignation, but a recalibration of hope, shifting it away from outcomes she could not change and toward influence she could still exert. The FBI's role in that influence persisted quietly, reflected in altered checklists, expanded interagency data sharing, and an institutional memory that resisted erasure. New cases were still imperfect, still constrained by resources and judgment calls, but fewer were dismissed casually, fewer were allowed to drift without scrutiny. Daniel's absence had become a presence within those decisions, an unspoken reminder that silence demands interpretation. Rachel saw this most clearly when a young investigator told her that the first missing persons case he ever worked was escalated early because a supervisor referenced Daniel Mercer's file. That single decision led to rapid intervention and a life spared. The investigator framed it as procedure. Rachel heard it as echo. She realized then that legacy is rarely about recognition, but about continuity, about actions influenced by experiences passed forward. In her own life, Rachel found equilibrium gradually, rebuilding routines that had been suspended, re-engaging with work, forming new relationships that respected her past without being defined by it. She learned to speak Daniel's name without the sharp intake of breath that once accompanied it, allowing memory to coexist with normalcy. Friends noticed the change, not because grief vanished, but because it softened, becoming part of her rather than her entirety. On certain mornings, she still imagined Daniel on his run, headphones in, mind tracing patterns invisible to others. And she allowed that image to remain uncorrected by reality, because it honored who he was rather than how he died. The FBI's final internal summary of the case concluded with a measured assessment, noting procedural improvements and acknowledging limitations. It did not offer moral language or emotional commentary, but Rachel read between the lines, sensing accountability embedded in restraint. She appreciated that restraint more than dramatization, because it reflected the seriousness of what had been learned. As years passed, the case receded from public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies, newer investigations, but within professional circles, it retained relevance, cited sparingly, but decisively, when discussions turned to escalation thresholds and pattern recognition. Daniel Mercer's story became a tool, not a spectacle, a means of sharpening judgment rather than attracting attention. Rachel occasionally received messages from people who had encountered the case indirectly, through training, articles, or conversations, thanking her for speaking when it mattered. She responded when she could, not out of obligation, but because she understood the value of acknowledgement. Each message reinforced the idea that meaning accumulates through repetition, through consistent application of lessons learned. The river trail remained unchanged, its ordinariness undisturbed, a reminder that danger does not announce itself with spectacle. Rachel walked it less often now, not because it hurt less, but because she no longer needed the ritual to anchor memory. Daniel was present without it. She had integrated his absence into her understanding of the world, carrying it lightly but deliberately. In this integration, she found peace of a particular kind, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of coherence, where events, actions, and responses aligned into a narrative that made sense, even if it remained incomplete. The FBI's involvement in Daniel's case had transformed a missing person report into a murder inquiry, but its deeper impact lay in how it altered perception, challenging assumptions that once delayed action. Rachel believed this shift mattered more than any single conviction, because it addressed the conditions that allowed disappearance to masquerade as choice. In reflecting on the journey, she recognized that the story's power lay not in its tragedy, but in its insistence, its refusal to be dismissed, its demand for attention where silence once prevailed. Daniel Mercer had not intended to become a catalyst, but his nature, analytical, principled, unwilling to ignore patterns, made him one nonetheless. His life and death illustrated a truth that Rachel carried forward. That vigilance begins with noticing, that systems change when questioned, and that silence, when examined, can reveal everything it was meant to hide. The story ended not with closure, but with responsibility, a responsibility shared by those who learned from it, those who applied its lessons, and those who continued to look more closely when routines broke without explanation. In that shared responsibility, Daniel's presence endured, not as a missing person, not solely as a murder victim, but as a reminder that truth often waits patiently for someone willing to see it, and that once seen, it reshapes what follows. The case began the morning Daniel Mercer failed to answer his phone. And before we go any further, take a second to comment where you are watching from right now and subscribe to the channel, because this story crosses borders, assumptions, and the thin line between disappearance and death, and it all started with a silence that felt louder than any scream. Daniel Mercer was not the kind of man who vanished without explanation. At 39, he lived by routines that anchored his life. The same cafe every weekday morning, the same jogging route along the river at dawn, the same weekly call to his younger sister, Rachel, every Sunday night without fail. When Rachel's call went unanswered on that Sunday, she told herself he was busy. When Monday passed without a text, unease crept in. By Tuesday, she drove to his apartment and found it locked, neat, untouched, as if he had stepped out for milk and never returned. His car was still parked below, wallet and keys were inside, and his phone lay charging on the nightstand. Missing person cases often begin like this, quietly, without drama, and law enforcement initially treated Daniel's disappearance the same way, filing paperwork, asking neighbors routine questions, suggesting adults have the right to disappear. But Rachel insisted something was wrong, because Daniel never missed a run, never missed work, never missed her call. She spoke with a certainty that came from years of knowing his habits, and that certainty planted the first seed of doubt in the minds of local detectives. They learned Daniel worked as a data analyst for a logistics firm, a job that involved sensitive routing information, but nothing classified, nothing dangerous. His colleagues described him as cautious, private, unfailingly polite. No enemies, no debts, no romantic entanglements dramatic enough to explain vanishing. Yet as days passed, small inconsistencies surfaced. Security cameras showed Daniel leaving his office building on Friday evening, but none captured him entering his apartment afterward. His jogging shoes were gone, but his fitness tracker had stopped recording data abruptly at 6:42 a.m. Saturday morning, mid-run, in an area of the river trail known for poor signal. Local police conducted a ground search, combed the riverbanks, interviewed joggers, and found nothing. Public appeals went out, flyers appeared, and Daniel's face joined thousands of others online, framed by the word missing. Rachel moved into his apartment, sleeping on the couch, listening for footsteps that never came. The first real shift in the case happened when a detective noticed Daniel had accessed an unusual set of files the week before he disappeared, unrelated to his assigned projects. It was subtle, buried in server logs, but it suggested curiosity about routes, shipments, and schedules outside his scope. The firm claimed it was likely a mistake, but the pattern nagged at investigators. Then came the anonymous email sent to Rachel, short and cryptic, stating, "Stop looking if you want him safe." There was no demand, no signature, no way to trace it. That message changed the tone of the investigation overnight. What had been framed as a voluntary disappearance now carried the scent of coercion. Surveillance expanded, subpoenas followed, and federal thresholds quietly came into play. When agents from the FBI reviewed the digital trail, they saw something local police had not connected. Daniel's data access overlapped with a broader investigation into cargo theft and organized crime operating across state lines. The moment the FBI stepped in, the missing person narrative fractured. This was no longer about a man who wandered off or drowned unnoticed. It was about whether Daniel had seen something he was never meant to see. Rachel was informed gently, but the weight of federal involvement terrified her more than comforted her. It meant Daniel's disappearance was part of something larger, something dangerous. As weeks turned into months, the absence hardened into a presence, shaping every decision, every thought. The FBI worked quietly, mapping Daniel's last movements, cross-referencing cell tower pings, financial records, and license plate readers, constructing a shadow version of his final days. And within that shadow, investigators began to sense a darker truth forming, one that would eventually force them to reclassify the case, because sometimes a missing person is not missing at all, but taken, silenced, and hidden behind a story that was never meant to be found.